MINDBEND, non-ordinary and extraordinary states of consciousness for MINDBEND Creative.
All right, everyone, welcome to the Denim Dudes podcast, broadcasting live from the hinterlands of Santa Monica, California.
Perfect.
Lev, I'm so glad you were able to make it in today. We talked about doing this for a while, and I'm catching you right before you split town.
That's right.
Yeah,
going
big
to Nashville.
stuff coming up. Tell us about it. You're a musician.
Yes, I am. Yeah, I sing, I play guitar, I produce some fun electronic music, I play the festivals, I try to tour around when I can. I'm leaving for Nashville, doing a little industry showcase in Nashville, and tracking an album with a pretty killing band out there.
Awesome. The band is in Nashville, and
They're
you're meeting up with them there.
Nashville, yep,
A lot of bands out in Nashville, right? A lot of players.
Yeah. I didn't really know about Nashville very much until the last couple of years, and I've started going out there a lot recently.
Nice. I think your sound and your persona is suited for that world, it seems.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I kind of do a lot of the folk stuff, but country, there's a really blurry line between country and folk. And no one really knows, I think, where that is.
Yeah.
It's probably somewhere in the twang and storytelling. So I've always considered myself a folk artist. My parents grew up listening. I grew up listening to a lot of 60s folk music, you know, a lot of Neil Young or Simon and Garfunkel or Van Morrison, Johnny Cash, Joni Mitchell, that kind of stuff. But only now I wouldn't say I'm dabbling in country. I think I'm just becoming more open.
Well, it's like when you ran off the list of those names of artists, you know, you went Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, Johnny Cash. I think everything's music, and then there's marketing. You know?
Good
like,
point. Okay.
It's all like music, and then, well, we need to sell something to this person, so we got to call it something so it matches their outfit.
That's
you know?
right. That's right. Yeah, good point. And I think of the list, Johnny Cash was mostly marketed as a country artist and was a country artist. But
somebody like Townes Van Sant, you know, like they've got everything that would appeal to a country western fan and a folk fan and an alternative fan. I mean,
right. There's so much crossover. Yeah. And then it's like, you know, when you strip things down, which often I do, which is just like me and acoustic guitar, you know, there's less holes you can really put somebody in stylistically. You know, and I think a lot of times genre comes from instrumentation a lot of times, whether it be rhythm, drums, whether it's like you add a horn section, a string section, it's going to help define the genre a little more. But when you have somebody that's you strip everything away, that's why I actually like it, because then it's a little bit harder to define. And I thrive in those kind of transitional places.
Well, we're going to talk about transitional places today for sure. Yeah. Part of the idea of having Lev on the show today was bringing more musicians into the MINDBEND fold, because I think that as I continue to grow with the platform, you know, this started as an offshoot from my work at Psychedelic Spotlight, and then just really enjoying having the conversations, meeting the people who are working in the psychedelic space. But then there's so many different tributaries that bring a person into and through that world, right?
Yes.
And I think, you know, the performing arts and music in particular is a big part of ritual practice and a big part of personal practice.
Absolutely.
And it's a zone where people have to confront who they are, what they have inside them, and then bring that to the forefront of their lives, right? Like either in ceremony, like maybe ceremony plant medicine ritual, or writing a song, or performing in front of a crowd. And also just the mental health component too, because a lot of artists and a lot of musicians, people that endeavor to write something, are mining from their internal well of feeling, you know, and a lot of that can be like challenging feeling, darker feeling, you know, struggle feeling. So that's the hope, is to bring more conversations with artists. And I do want to give you a chance specifically today to speak about psychedelic moments in your life, whether that's traditional psychedelic medicine induced, or moments that were, you could qualify as non-ordinary, extraordinary consciousness. Because one of the things I think about for musicians is when you're performing, you access a kind of flow state too, which I think people do that through sex, they do that through meditation, they do that through shopping sprees or whatever, you know, like there's different kinds of consciousness that you can access, right?
But
I think in music, there's a particular way. So I'd love to have you talk about because you're someone that's come on Psychedelic Spotlight before, and we visited about some of your experiences. Maybe we'll revisit some of those today.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in a kind of an interesting environment and way with my family, and we did grow up taking psychedelics together as a family, and those were some pretty influential parts of my life that, when I get the opportunity to talk about, I do. And was fortunate enough to be on some front lines of watching the cultural shift and narrative about psychedelics, specifically in the legality of psychedelics. And when I was growing up taking them with my family, it was pretty secretive, and a lot has changed since I was a young teenager.
Yeah.
And how things are viewed, whether it be medicine ceremonies or just, the general cultural outlook and legality of, like, I had to keep things really secret. I had to keep things, even from my friends. I couldn't get high with my friends. I couldn't talk about me doing drugs with my parents until I was like 18. So it was actually this intense secret that I had to keep from everyone, like from the fear of getting taken away from my family. And I do think a lot has changed since all this was happening, but maybe we were even chatting about it last time, but I realized, I think while we were talking, I'm trying to figure out how to put this into words better.
Sure.
But there was I came at it from a flipped angle where I think there was a desacredization, is what I've been calling it. From when I was just finally able to, like, tell my friends I was doing this, and I grew up doing psychedelics in a very sacred way with my family, and I was just so stoked to just get high with a buddy or go on a mushroom journey in the forest on, like, an adventure kind of thing for fun,
without it needing to be such a formalized rite or family oriented even event. Yeah.
And you said rite. Yeah, in a way it was kind of like a rite of passage in the family. I was like, on the 15th birthday was your first mushroom experience. I was the youngest, so it was a bit early for me, but that was kind of, we didn't really grow up. I grew up kind of half Jewish, but was never bar mitzvahed, and we had not many other rites of passage ceremonies. I think even culturally, I've noticed that there's not a lot of rite of passage ceremonies that we have around us, and that, I think, was a big one looking back retroactively in my life.
Extraordinarily. I don't hear often of rites of passage contemporarily that are based around mushrooms.
Yeah.
Or 15-year-old young people with their families. I mean, I remember when you first told that story, it's such an exceptional anecdote. And really, coming up in the late 80s, early 90s, in that time, like, what an interesting period for psychedelics in the zeitgeist. It was really kind of way after the 60s and 70s, and then way before research and clinical studies in the 2000s. And
exactly. It was a strange in-between period. And I was fortunate enough to hear my parents and dad specifically were pretty tapped in with a wonderful group of individuals who are fighting for drug policy reform, and specifically things like Prop 215 or SB 420 for medical marijuana was actually originally conceived in my old house that burned down 16 years ago this week. Not that the legislation was in the early 90s, but the house burned down, around 16 years ago. And that was also a big part of my life, which was that place, which was a hub for a lot of people to gather, really fascinating individuals to gather that both my parents were tapped into.
And I'd love to hear more about some of those individuals. The one that I know of that you've spoken before is Ram Dass.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Yeah, he was a dear friend. He and my dad were very close, and I grew up in a way of him being kind of like a grandfather figure. I don't know how much I can totally talk about for certain individuals' sake, but I loved. I wasn't very deep into. I wasn't necessarily a devotee. Maybe we talked about this previously, but I didn't grow up. I grew up with the air around him, but just loved him as a human, and he loved me and us and my family. And my first mushroom trip was at his house. Anyways, I could honestly talk about Ram Dass all the time. I love that man.
And this audience has not heard anything that you talked about before.
Okay, good to know. Good to know. I wasn't sure
Clean
exactly.
Slate.
Clean slate.
This is a whole different.
I appreciate that. Let's go. So he always loved me and my music and was very supportive. I would often attend the kirtans at his house. He had a stroke, first of all, for those who don't know, in the mid to late 90s, and was paralyzed and lost half of his movement in his body and was in a wheelchair. And then my family and dad specifically spent a lot of time on Maui with him, where he moved. And throughout that period, very formative years of my life, and certain directions I do have to contribute to his advice, even if it was just one word, because sometimes it would take a while for him to speak, and it might be a long 10-second pause, but that kind of makes you lean in closer and anticipate what that word is going to be. And I remember when I got into college in Boston, in Berkeley, and I was debating which college I was going to go to. I was with him, and one of the words he said was Boston. And there was this moment where I just knew my whole life. I was like, I'm about to move to Boston. It was all just got clarified. And he also grew up around Boston in Newton, just outside of Boston in the suburbs, and spent a lot of his years at Harvard, teaching at Harvard with Timothy Leary and studying psychedelics. And there's an amazing, wonderful book for those who care called the Harvard Psychedelic Club that goes into a lot of these really wonderful studies they were doing at the time before psychedelics were really illegal. And you could even maybe blame them for a lot of the illegal
notoriety, at least.
Yes, yeah, specifically Timothy Leary. Anyways, so my life with him and was really a loving, sweet relationship. And I want to circle back to the point where I never felt like I was necessarily a devotee to him as always a spiritual leader. It was more of this loving family member.
And no one forced you into being a devotee or putting upon you the sense of obligation to act one way or another, which I think is a real blessing.
It was a real blessing. And even for my dad, they were goofballs together. You know, they were jokesters. They loved laughing at things and kind of zooming out from there's I think the best way to say it is an example I give is I would often attend his kirtans. Whether I'm staying with him at his place, I would oftentimes tap in and start chanting with people. But I'm not necessarily one, again, who's a devotee, but I'm familiar enough just through osmosis and environmentally. I would become reasonably familiar with these chants going on. But he would always just ask me to sing my own song when I was there. And he was very often promoting and giving me a space to share whatever I was working on.
Wow.
Which was incredibly sweet and incredibly kind. Again, I enjoyed jamming and chanting and the kirtan, but I really gravitated more towards my own personal songwriting. And
I love that so much because it takes away some of the rigidity around, like, this is our space of special momentness and it has to be this way. Like, he was able to honor your individual ideation of what was sacred to you.
Yes, exactly. And maybe not to a detriment, but like, I was a kid. I've had a lot of growing pains. To be fully honest, I was ridiculous, man. I had some moments and phases where I was just wild and maybe too off the deep end, and he still supported and gave space and graciousness to me coming to share whatever it was that I was doing or working on, and looking back, retroactively, there were some moments that were probably rather funny and questionable for him to even allow me in that space to do that, but he always would, and I'll always love him for that.
So let's zoom out and look at contemporary culture and this idea of psychedelics, right? And how it relates to the world of maybe cannabis too. Like a lot of the talk in this world is around what people are doing to prepare for a deeper integration of psychedelics into the culture at large. And a lot of that is around the medicalization of psychedelics, which has a lot of people who are indigenous minded or representing communities that aren't going to immediately benefit from or are purposely being like edged out of that landscape, you know, concerned, right? So it's every time I'm around, because I never knew I was going to be in this space, but being in this space now and witnessing all of these different invested parties and their pitches, there's a lot of emotional energy on many areas of the spectrum around this issue of what does it mean to have this thing known as psychedelics and to interact with it, and what do we want to do with it apart from a tremendous amount of vested capital being glorified and maximized in time because something gets approved and people can start making money off of it, right? So there's like a practice around it, there's a stigma around it. How are you familiar with psychedelics now, and what are you seeing, like whether it's part of your practice or peers or friends?
100%. Yeah, great question, man. Well, specifically to start with cannabis, it was the gateway drug when I was much younger, and before kind of dabbling in psychedelics per se. I think I would just love the culture of it when I was literally a child, and not that I was even always smoking it, but I just like being around it. Like I would ceremoniously love to like light my parents' pipe, even though I wasn't getting high. I just wanted to be around that attitude adjustment or consciousness shift. There was maybe a specialness and a sacredness that I really gravitated towards, especially as a really young kid. And over time, it fused together in a lot of ways with the musical practice, like you're mentioning, and that kind of ritual. And I think once I started doing weed, but also other psychedelics alone, was when I started having some pretty tremendous benefits of experimentation. And when I started taking music more seriously, and not just singing or songwriting, I mean, I play a handful of instruments and I would conduct different experiments on myself, whereas like, okay, if I take this dosage of LSD and sit down on the drum set and I'm going to stay here for 4 hours and not get up, or I'm going to, play guitar on this dose of mushrooms for 6 hours, and kind of keep myself engaged in the instrument, no matter where the trip really went, no matter where it might get difficult or physically taxing, but I still would keep that energy focused into the instrument. And then it's like, what does my expression through this mode, how does that translate? From maybe it's not a bad trip, but an overwhelming, difficult trip. And how does that energy leave through this? And it became a vessel of expression, and where positive or negative interpretations and feelings could leave through. And the tricky part about it is always recording it or remembering it. And so over time, I started getting better and better and better at bringing it back into my day-to-day or existence, because I'm not going to be on psychedelics every day. In fact, I have different rhythms, how infrequently I do it, but to this day I still enjoy and prioritize solo musical psychedelic experiences. And it could be even, again, for like my own songwriting, I'm not going to come back with a perfectly structured experience. It's going to be a feeling. It's going to be some vague, powerful, emotional thing that I undergo, and hopefully have some like voice memo going while running naked through the mountains or something with my guitar. And hopefully I capture like a butterfly this moment or this feeling, and then later, like the next day or in the integration process, retroactively fuse it together, create structure, and oftentimes even create meaning from it. So it doesn't happen in the moment, because the space of when I'm undergoing whatever powerful experience, there's just so much happening. And I think that interpretation and ability to fully and properly communicate is for later. In the moment, I just want to undergo it and go through it as deeply as I can. And music is a great, powerful tool to sonically capture that space. And so in a way, I've kind of devoted my life to those kind of rituals and taking that back. It's not always how I write or create, but I do try to regularly have some type of experience. And to the point where, and maybe we could even talk about this, I'm actually putting out a whole psychedelic album in 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. This is something that I don't think we've talked about before. It's called Family Trips, in reference to me going on and taking psychedelics with my family growing up. Essentially, the album is almost every psychedelic experience I've had for the last year and a half, I've professionally recorded. And I've set up a good microphone. And since last March, I've gone through and I've done a bunch of mostly like throat singing and strange vocalization. And every song is essentially the name of whatever substance I was on. So there's the LSD song, there's the MDMA song, there's the 2CB song, there's the MDA song. And it's like 10, 20, 30, maybe 40 minutes of me throat singing or doing some type of vocalization. And it's an absolutely extraordinarily trippy project. And I feel like I've never been so proud of something. It's very different than anything I've ever touched or put out, but this is something that's rather fascinating. It's rather fascinating. And to hear the different influences of substances on your vocal folds is a wild experiment. And I'm curious how people are going to experience this thing. It's not music created for like, if you go to festival culture, it's not going to be like there's a group of people leading a ceremony. It's not like that kind of thing. It's not for people to take psychedelics
it's more
and
of
listen
a painting.
Yes, exactly. And it's the opposite of like, I'm going to take psychedelics and listen to this thing. It's more of a fly on the wall experience for those who have never taken psychedelics, or for anyone to just listen to what it's like to be alone with this dude on psychedelics in their room.
Did you produce the tracks? Did you take the throat singing and double it, add reverb here, pitch shift one down, fly in an electronic drum beat?
Great question. I tried to do nothing. I put in crazy reverb at the time when I was recording it. And I'm sometimes playing like some type of pad or a synthesizer underneath, just
live while you're having the experience.
Yeah, like as a bass tone while I was doing it.
Okay.
But for the most part, literally, the whole thing is whatever that experience was. I did edit a little bit in there, just in terms of like arbitrarily. Sometimes I'll be like, I have to take that thing out, and it was strange to see what was that choice as to like, what was too far or what was too weird, because there's some weird stuff in there. Really weird.
How weird could it get?
I'm talking the strangest part of your voice that is genuinely going to creep people out or make people uncomfortable. But I left most of it, all of it in. But, sometimes I would, whether there was like a laugh or a throat clearing, I would kind of take those out, or like a weird breath that I would take. Sometimes I would say, okay, I'm going to take that out. But I left in vast majority of the really uncomfortable parts of our vocal folds.
Uncomfortable to hear?
Yeah, maybe. It could be a feeling. I've only shared it with a few people, but watched their reactions, and that's my way of gauging, like, how is this going to translate?
Are there any other works of music art out there that you're aware of? Like, did Hendrix ever do like I'm going to do this drug this day and record a solo here, and then or anyone?
I wonder. That's a great question. I don't know, man. Do you know of anything?
I don't think I do. I mean, it sounds like it probably was happening.
Yeah,
but
sure.
I don't know if it's ever been documented and presented as such.
Sure.
I don't think the Kinks had a record that had.
Yeah. Maybe Pink Floyd or like some Dark Side of the Moon thing had some sort of intentional psychedelic interpretation. But I think in this case, it started as just me naturally doing what I kind of naturally do. And you can even listen on the album, on the first track, on the LSD one, where I'm like realizing. And I even say, I'm like, is this the album? and you can watch the whole thing develop.
I was wondering how much you're going to be able to maintain the fourth wall.
Yeah. No, I'm laughing hysterically at some moments.
And that's on the record?
It's on the record. Yeah, it's all there, but deep reverb, like submerged underwater reverb. And it's a trip, man.
Who have you shared it with so far?
I shared a couple tracks with my girlfriend. My buddy Michael has heard one of the tracks. I did share it with Rick Doblin, the head of Maps, and he hasn't listened to it yet, but he said he'll get back to me. And I'm slowly trying to get it out there. Again, it comes out November 20th. Or wait, I got to double check that. November 22nd. And yeah, it's not the kind of thing where I'm able to like submit it for Spotify playlists or take the classic marketing approach.
Yeah. No, clearly it's a different piece of art. It's a different effort.
It is. Yeah. It is. And I'm curious how it's going to go. I don't know how it's going to go.
So you gave us a little bit of the menu, but I'm assuming how many tracks are on the record? Are there as many as 8 to 10?
I think there's 6 tracks.
6, okay. And you said LSD, MDMA, NAD?
MDA.
MDA.
And then 2CB.
2CB.
Which is like a phenethylamine. There's 2CB, 2CI, 2CE. Alexander Shulgin created those. They're kind of supposed to synthesize certain actual LSD or certain other drugs.
I didn't hear a lot about 2CB, but where is that happening? Is that something that is scheduled as illegal?
It wasn't for a long time, and they were like the research chemicals that you could like get online. Okay. But it's a good ambiguous question now, as I think you take such a small amount of this crystalline white powder, but people, I think there was a time a few years ago where somebody confused it with cocaine or something and then took a whole line of it or something. And I think there may have been a couple overdoses like that resulted in death. And I do believe it's more illegal now than it was. People out there, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, there'll be corrections, but it never comes up. 2CB never comes up.
Yeah, it's not as, let's say, popular, but the man who created it, Alexander Shulgin, he was the one who popularized MDMA.
Yeah.
And he, to the day he died, I was fortunate enough to meet him at one of the early MAPS conferences back in 2010. And he was like 90 years old and mostly blind. But he still, to that day, had his little laboratory in his garage where he synthesizes these things. And he tests them with, he and his wife would take them together. And I do think there's a lot of potential and extraordinary experiences that are allowed through these substances, but I don't do them very often. It had been so many years since I tried one, but I thought, what the hell for this project, and again, you'll hear the difference. It's hard to verbally speculate on like what the difference is between the songs, but. Yeah.
I was going to ask you if we finish going down the menu of compounds. So we've laid out the ones, and then what's left? So
actually, there was MDMA 1 and 2. So there's 2 MDMAs.
Okay.
And then there's also 2 LSDs.
2 LSDs.
LSD 1 and 2.
Okay, and 2CB and LSD.
MDA.
Or
Yeah.
MDA.
Yeah, exactly. And so those substances, I didn't do a psilocybin one. I didn't do mushrooms. Partly, I just hate having a screen in front of me. Mostly on any psychedelic, having a screen there can be uncomfortable, but especially on mushrooms.
Because you had to interface a little bit with the technology in
Little
your studio.
bit.
Yeah, but mostly you could kind of close your eyes and float around
Yep.
and do your...
I'm good at this point in my life. I'm good about preparatory work. We're like setting it all up beforehand and being just ready to go. So very minimal interfacing. That's a great way to say it.
Okay, so you said you don't know if you could really distinctly vocalize the difference between the tracks, or were there any like emotional echoes that you have that you could reflect on for us? Like,
it feels really good to sing first and foremost.
For anyone at any time.
Anyone, especially on a psychedelic, when you're able to get it out and resonate. There's a really important thing, I think, in general, we hold our voices in and develop different blockages. And so the process of listening to this record is the process of listening to me actively releasing those limitations and seeking freedom, seeking expansion, seeking transcendence is I think the goal. And part of the process was me literally learning how to use certain parts of my throat. So it's a little bit difficult to differentiate just because on that first track, on the first LSD one, I literally listened to me discover a part of my voice I never knew. And over the course of a year, I get better and better at that. And I practice that more. And so it's hard to say which substance was assisting more because I'm just getting more comfortable with this undertone I've been developing. And then I also developed an overtone, like a series of almost whistle tones. And it's a combination of those two things happening.
So everything was a variation of throat singing then?
Mostly.
Okay. And that's a discipline that you had to, that's a type of singing that you had to kind of learn, practice, and get acquainted with.
Yeah, and that learning is the album. And essentially I'm doing it not just, over the last year I've been really trying to train it better. And I'm calling it throat singing. There is some different technical ways of throat singing, from Mongolian throat singing to Tuvan throat singing. There's different ways in which people throat sing. This is my own kind of direction I'm trying to train. And when I try to learn other modalities, I can injure myself sometimes. So I'm trying to be really, really careful.
Because you have to, this is your moneymaker.
It is. And I've been struggling recently. In full disclosure, I got really intense sickness after this big festival I played in July. I think it was strep or mono or something, where I took antibiotics, but my voice hasn't quite been the same since, and it's been many months. So I did a vocal rest a couple weeks ago, no speaking for a week. I took a steroid. I went to a laryngologist who shoved a laryngoscope down my throat and had you sing while they're like, the cameras are like shoved down your throat, and then there's a wire one that goes through your sinuses and then down in. And literally I'm like, trying to resonate your vocal fold. And I don't know if you've ever seen your own, but it's like everyone has this really strange alien vagina in their throat, and it is the craziest thing to see.
Feed me Seymour.
Yeah, it actually does kind of look like that flower from Little Shop of Horrors, exactly. And it's a wild thing to see. I was nervous that I had developed nodes or polyps or things that I'd have to have surgery on. But in this case, it's prenodal. It could turn into something dangerous, but right now it was just more vocal rest, and the steroid kind of helped jumpstart the recovery. And still healing. Wow. Yeah, but it brings up a lot of things. Reprioritizing my whole life, wondering who I am, and who are we without our voice, and not just as singers, but even just as people in community and culture, talking in society, and how I think in my mind is my voice, and if I don't have that, how do I think about things? And so, yeah, full honesty, I didn't mean to go down this rabbit hole, but I've been really undergoing a pretty intense existential revamp of my life recently.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you also for sparing some of your vocal gas on this interview.
Oh,
man.
totally.
like sharing your voice now.
Yeah.
My grandparents grew up next to, and I think this it's okay to use this terminology, but I believe deaf mute is the term for what they use sign language, and they could only speak through kind of squeaking kind of vocalizations, right? They
Both your
couldn't talk.
grandparents?
They grew up next door to, they grew up next door to a couple that was deaf and mute, right? They couldn't speak and they couldn't hear. They used sign language. And I've never been able to interview someone who's like that. And I've never met anybody in the psychedelic space that's even spoken to what their experience of psychedelics has been. And that would be fascinating for me somehow to someday connect with people who have journeyed in that way and not had a voice or hearing to kind of frame the experience through.
Fascinating. I'm glad you're putting that out there, because I'm sure that's an experience that many have had. And
And
I'm curious.
Let's put it out there and see if someone winds up coming this way, because
It does make me think. I mean, there was this film I saw years ago called Babel. I don't know if you saw that, but there was a scene in that where this Japanese girl, she couldn't hear. She was deaf, but she took MDMA at this club, and the whole scene is you almost feel these like low thumping of the beat of the bass. But it's her experience at this rave on MDMA at this club, but she's deaf. And it's a really powerful scene. I haven't seen the movie in like 20 years, but I've just never forgot that scene.
Wow.
Yeah, really strange movie. But what you said just kind of brought that up for me.
So being from a family that was unique compared to a lot of families that I've known, who exposed you to the consideration of a rite of passage and also different states of consciousness, because really, like, did anyone ever frame it like, this is going to show you that there are ways of experiencing your life that are different than the majority of the moments of your life, and these moments can potentially help you in this way, or these moments might be challenging, but they're going to lead towards this kind of. I'd like to get into the under the hood and into the nitty gritty of, apart from you can envision the bucolic atmosphere and everybody hanging out and it's peaceful and tropes, but there's a purpose and there's a actual exercise and there's work that's entailed, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So a big part of how my parents, I think is what you mean, how they approached introducing it to us. Is that part of the question?
and what their
intention.
Yes, and their practice was like.
And like, I'm fortunate enough to still have my father around and am able to still talk to him about it. But I'm constantly blown away the older I get, how fucking bold it was for them to do what they did. And I think there's only so much intention they had going into it, wanting to cultivate our relationship in a deeper way and communication in
the family relationship.
Our family relationship, whether it be between me and my brothers or vice versa and all of us. But I think generally it's been really interesting to just navigate and look retroactively, like, what was that choice like for them to do that in the first place? And we would talk about, like, obviously having intentions going into each one. We light the candles, the tropes you're talking about, but on a macro level, to just make the plunge to give a decent size full eighth of mushrooms to their kids. Not a microdose. It was the first experiences were a big, large, full, powerful experience, and ended up being wonderful. But I think a priority for them was education. The way I look at it is like, rather than being with our sketchy middle school friend or high school friend and have some strange experience that a lot of times is the case, why not be with your family? And why not have that experience together? Especially when there's so much potential there.
Potential for?
I think psychedelics in general hold a space of extreme potential, positive and negative, I think, as a tool in our society, whether it be through our evolution or personal choices. In this case, potential to deepen our relationship with self and family. We were fortunate enough, like we were talking about before, to be surrounded by some pretty wonderful other human beings. And my parents would very much stress education. And again, this is a time before a lot of psychedelic education, in that kind of weird, awkward phase you mentioned as to where psychedelics stood in our culture in the 90s. And you know, fortunate enough to take the ideas kind of brought forth through like Ram Dass, especially at Harvard, with understanding set and setting, and really, you know, going into what that means and what that means to us at the time. But researching, you couldn't just go online and learn about a lot of this stuff. You couldn't
even go online for the most part.
You couldn't even go online. But by the time I started, you could go online. But there was only like this one website called Erowid, if you're familiar, and it was also, yeah, it was harder to come by information, so much more than it is now. And so I was so grateful to be surrounded by some really wonderful, legendary human beings that my parents had in our periphery, but also they really stressed that education and that personal education as to understanding these things, understanding what this personal experience might be with this dosage, and make sure that you are surrounded in a safe place with the right people, that we're mentally in a good headspace to undergo something that is potentially risky and a transformative experience and potentially negative experience. And all of these trips that we had together, they weren't all positive.
Yeah, talk about
amazing.
The challenges. Talk about what could be described as negative or risky.
Yeah, I mean, you know, some of these ones early on in my teenage years were really formative. Looking back, I think it forced a lot of things to the surface. I think it forced a lot of maybe buried issues that my brothers and I had together that were kind of confronted. We never, I think, ever physically fought ever again since we started taking mushrooms together. But we were a wild bunch of boys, and we got, you know, really fucking intense when we were kids, and we fought a lot. But it turned into a different mode of communication, and probably a more peaceful mode of communication. There's a part of it that was, I've been kind of resisting going into concrete, specific stories of this, but I can illuminate a little bit. One of my first mushroom experiences, essentially on Thanksgiving, because I grew up vegetarian. I've never eaten meat before, but we would on Thanksgiving, instead of eating turkey, we would eat mushrooms. That became a pretty regular ritual. And one Thanksgiving, I had a moment, one of my real first profound religious, spiritual, whatever you want to call it, experiences of my life. I went up to our rooftop and was watching sunset, and I was standing on our railing. That was a very big drop down, like a huge drop. Maybe not all the way to die drop, but I would break a lot of bones if I fell off this railing. And I was balancing perfectly on this railing, staring at the sun. and I was getting blasted as a 15, 16-year-old with this radiant, warm, beautiful, godlike energy of just profound confidence and safety and knowing I wasn't going to fall. And just the first time I really felt this inner balance in a very, very profound physical way. And I remember, I kind of got to go back in my memory on this one, but I remember staring at the sun for a long time. And I would see my dad off in the distance sometimes, and he would wave me down. And he'd be like, get off of that railing, you know? And then maybe, 20 minutes would go by and I'd see him again and he would wave me down. And eventually he sent my brother up to come bring me down. And I told my brother, I'm not going to fall. And I said it in a really intense, confident way, where my brother understood very clearly and he knew I was going to be okay, but he was that middle ground where he had to go communicate that I was going to be safe to my dad. And put yourself in my dad's perspective. He's giving mushrooms to his 15-year-old child who's walking, balancing on this railing high above the ground in a very dangerous way.
You were standing on the railing,
I was
not
standing.
leaning against it?
Yeah, not leaning against it. I'm standing, balancing on my feet on this vertical railing about this long.
I would be nervous if I was your dad.
100%, as would I. However, I wasn't my dad. I was myself in this balanced way. And so he eventually came up and strongly advised me to come down, which I listened eventually. But this is maybe after like an hour or so. And I go back downstairs and
it's a long sunset.
It's a long sunset. Yeah, it had gone, it had passed, and it was like the afterglows and everything.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's my favorite time of day, hands down.
Hands
every
down.
day.
Hands down. And in this one especially, it was a profoundly beautiful one. And I was really staring at the sun to the point where afterwards I, couldn't totally, I could see, but everything I would look at would have a tinge of that pinkness to it.
Yeah.
And that lasted, to be honest, almost a month.
Oh,
yeah. It was
dear.
like
I wasn't going to call you on that, but I was thinking that alone, regardless of height or mushrooms, would be a challenge.
It was. And so that ended up being kind of like this afterglow scar of what subsequently happened, which was my dad. Long story short, I don't need to go into the whole thing, but he exhibited extreme fear. And at a certain point, as we were coming down, wasn't able to contain that amount of fear and trying to be, not only my parent, but a safeguard and protect me, right?
Yeah.
And while I'm undergoing one of my first real existential, spiritual, self-bonding moments that I'd ever truly had. And so there was a deep, deep, profound divide. And I was experiencing his just like, not all the way to losing it, but he was really trying to contain himself and not totally successfully, undergoing pretty intense, overwhelming amount of like, maybe it caused some self-doubt in him for allowing me to do all of these things, but I could just...
Was he having a bad trip?
He was not having a bad trip, but he was trying to communicate how insanely afraid he was, which was totally valid, 100% valid. But I felt that in a very deep way, and and then it's like, how does this invalidate my experience? And it didn't necessarily, but what took me a long time to come to in this trip, where you could call it a bad trip, but it was this pull of my own life and my own choice of living. I didn't feel like it was totally up to me. And the responsibility and love I have for other people, especially my parents and my family, I literally feel like I owe it to them to take care of myself and to keep myself inside of my body and alive. And that was a really hard thing to come to. It was at the time, at least, it was a really difficult thing to accept and to feel, especially in that moment, because I think part of the freedom that I was experiencing in this moment of clarity was the confidence of my own balance, literally and internally, and safety, and that I wasn't going to fall and I wasn't going to die. There's no way I can communicate that to somebody who's trying to protect me because they're not myself. And so it was a parent and their child creating a real rift and divide, but eventually, came together, and we both learned from that and both talk about it to this day and how important it was. We just had an MDMA experience together on my mom's birthday last month and talked about the whole thing again. And in some ways we're still healing from it, but also it shaped who we are in a rather profound way. I've never talked about this on any sort of platform.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Well, thanks for bringing it out.
I think it's such a powerful anecdote. It illustrates, again, like you said, the potential that exists with the purposeful, intentional use of psychedelics.
Yeah.
It illustrates the unpredictability of the moments that can occur. And it illustrates really beautifully how the profundity of these events, of these moments and revelations that occur. It was a really beautiful and helpful anecdote.
Thank you.
Lev. Thank you.
I hope it made sense. I
was feeling it.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I think other people can relate to it as well, because I think, again, like as we near the end of the conversation, it's really, the first time I spoke to you, I came away with really feeling like I haven't had that many conversations with people, I alluded to this at the beginning of our conversation, who are able to speak to their upbringing in the way that you can. In working in this space, I just don't hear a lot about an immersion that's purposeful and family-based early on. Often it is, like you said, either someone who's haphazardly wandering into an experience that's not in a container and not intentional, or it's somebody who has turned to a radical methodology of healing because they are facing like tremendous suffering and adversity, and looking for a way through that, right? So to be able to speak to your experiences with the background that you do have, I think sharing that is an important part of this overall dialogue. And I know that there are other stories out there like yours. I'm sure there are probably more now maybe than 10, 15, 20 years ago too.
Yes, exactly.
As parents are of a different age and priorities are different, and the world is different, and we come to times where we go through entire years, hopefully you don't have to do this too much, but where we don't leave our homes, And so that family container and the divisiveness in the world, and like, so, if we want to value our container and have it be robust and let it be ugly and fragile and demonstrate what's necessary to really show up for families intensely, like what an incredible practice, man. I just think that that's a fascinating background to be able to speak from. And I love that you ultimately have been able to channel it into your artwork.
Yeah.
I would hazard a guess that some of your ability to express yourself in music channeling was probably informed by opening portals and opening and introspective abilities and the kind of ephemeral attributes that we associate with music, and maybe if we're not even thinking about it as casual listeners, that we sort of feel or we get.
Right the subconscious part of our listening. Absolutely.
Did you ever go crazy through self-abusive or self-destructive periods? Did you have that period where you were overusing something? Or
I think, I've definitely gone through phases with weed, with cannabis at different points in my life. Maybe throughout my 20s, I had kind of an intense off and on thing. The main issue is the combination with tobacco was something I struggled with. It was. I would say it was an abusive relationship at some points, and I'm so grateful to be kind of free from that. As when I think the danger is when our motivational daily experiences get meshed with our spiritual practices in that way, and there is a line where I think it can cross and become detrimental or a crutch or those kind of things, and tobacco weed combination and coffee and that kind of just cycle that they kind of propel each other and create this certain type of momentum that really did propel me through certain experiences of my life and creative phases, and being able to sit 13 hours at my computer and just crack away on all this video editing or whatever I'm working on creatively. I think there's definitely some assistance, but then after that, to like be able to let go and be unchained by them, I've gone through struggling moments, and very grateful to be on the other side of those. I think we all have addictive tendencies, and I'm a rather obsessive being, and so I'll get really into something, and I think it's part of what fuels me creatively, but also is something I need to keep in check sometimes. And certain substances only make me more obsessive. And so I think I just got to find the balance there. And these days I've been in a pretty good, healthy state and routine. I think coffee is a really tricky one still in my life.
Powerful plant.
It's a powerful plant. And there is a way in which I lean on it too much sometimes. But for the most part, I'm not too concerned about it. There have been times when I was concerned and had to stop. But yeah, this is kind of me just diving in and feeling like where are the things that have like too strong of a hold. Never with psychedelics, and anyone I think who really does psychedelics knows their extreme power of like, it's almost like they have reverse tolerances.
Yeah.
Where, the more you take, kind of the less you need, is my experience. And I have a specific anecdote towards that, of my first time ever taking LSD. I think I took like 18 liquid drops of this certain LSD, and knew the man who made it. And I had almost no experience at all. Like 12 hours later, I remember staring at the moon and felt something, but like mostly didn't even experience it at all. And, a year, 2 years later, I could take the exact same amount and take like 3 drops of that, 2 or 3 drops, and have a much stronger experience than I had that first time. I think part of what psychedelics do, open that portal or that space where you can listen to them a little better. And the more you learn them, I do think the less you need. And it's not quite the same thing as building a tolerance of, it's not like I have taken this much, so I need this much in order to have the same experience. It's a weird opposite effect. So I think that safeguards against addiction in general. And anyone, who has had too many mushrooms knows how fucking life-shatteringly terrifying it can be. And so I think that also, does protect against developing a addiction. I think there's a weird area of microdosing these days that people fall into, where it's like what do you call it?
Perceptual.
Sub-perceptual, where some people I do know maybe have a mild addiction to that. But I don't think it's necessarily extremely detrimental or dangerous or anything.
Well, so before we close, I'll ask for 2 nutshell 10-cent takes.
Hit me, dude.
You are connected to this space still. You're sharing songs with Rick Doblin, and you're able to speak about, everything we talked about today. So a nutshell on best case scenario for the near future in terms of like psychedelic growth and understanding and use or familiarity, and maybe.
Are we talking personally or macro culturally?
Culturally. Let's get your cultural viewpoint on a best case scenario with where we're headed, and something to be concerned over or aware of, or potential for it could be problematic.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Amazing question. I feel like a big priority right now is making sure this research can continue, especially that MAPS is leading and Rick is leading. I think there's a huge setback with recently with the Lido case of not allowing PTSD MDMA therapy, and I think hopefully soon in the next few years there will be a big shift of legality when it comes to MDMA and psilocybin therapy, specifically pertaining to PTSD, as it's a really important experience. And I think those are the near future steps. And I do think removing a lot of these substances from Schedule I and having a lot more access to them culturally will only increase the education of us knowing about them. And generally speaking, I think it's really dangerous having these psychedelics be so illegal, and it only creates for very negative things. We need more research. We need more education. Yeah.
So did you lump in the concern and the positive together there?
Oh, I guess I kind of did. I didn't intentionally address that. I think the main concern is where we've been for the last few decades, post Timothy Leary, post a lot of the research that was being done at Harvard. Yeah. And I think things have been literally put in a box, whether you blame Nixon or whoever you blame at the time, Leary, whoever, but they've been put inside of a box, and that box has been exploding and unfolding. And I do think there's insane amount of value in our culture. And so I think it is dangerous and continues to be dangerous to keep these substances unavailable, tampered with, meaning cut or laced with something.
I see.
And the more we can release, the chains of the legal system, I do believe the safer they can be. And obviously there's some dangers when it comes to pharmaceutical companies getting a hold of MDMA and what they're going to do in that department. But for the most part, I think there's extreme danger right now, and especially when it comes to the fentanyl world, as in any sort of white crystalline powder. And I think the clearer we can know our sources, and that I do believe comes through legality. And so more power to these wonderful people that are continuing to push this research, i.e. Rick Doblin and the rest of the crew.
Well, we're championing a lot of innovation off the planet in the atmosphere, but we're not so good at creating safe spaces on the planet.
That's right. Well, hey, hot take, maybe mushrooms are on other planets too.
Well, certainly. Yeah, there's probably a lot going on many other planets. We can only hope.
Yeah, that's a hilarious way to close off. So many more rabbit holes to go.
Next time we'll visit the planets that you visited in previous iterations.
Let me know. I'd love to come back, man. I appreciate you allowing me on here. And
totally, man. Thanks for making the time to do it. Where can people find your music and learn about when you might be coming to their town?
Yeah, so I am doing a bit of tours. I think I'm in a weird personal state of healing and trying to figure out the right thing to do with my voice. And I've let go of a lot of gigs and said no to a lot of gigs. And so I'm trying to reprioritize which are the most important ones. But essentially, I will be continuing to play some shows and release music. And you can find me at Mendeleev, which is my actual name. It's Mendeleev. Like the Russian chemist that organized the periodic table of elements. I'm named after that guy. And so if you can type his name out, you'll find me, Instagram, YouTube, wherever it may be. Spotify for sure. And yeah, definitely keep an eye out for Family Trips, which is November 22nd, my psychedelic weird throat singing album, and many, many more to come. Yeah.
I want to make you a periodic table shirt that has M-E.
I would not mind that.
Is that magnesium?
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
Is that MG?
No, it's not. It's wait, what's? I'm not actually sure, and I'm not the one to ask, to be honest with you. But I do know Mendeleev actually made his own element called what is it? Oh, Mendelevium. Mendelevium's like 118 or something, like lately added. But yeah, no, you should definitely, if you ever make that, let me know. I'll rep it.
Yeah, I'll wear it to your next show. A one-off deal.
I'll keep you posted when I got another show. I am always playing around.
Yeah.
And I leave in a few hours for Nashville for a big show. So
Thanks for sharing with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. Appreciate the invite.